Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome to this lecture, which is part of a lengthy series going on for 5 years, which is the period of time of our project, funded by the Leader Human Trust. It's a project on conspiracy and democracy, and we have quite frequent Tuesday evening public lectures. We're looking at conspiracy theories and conspiracies, the relation between them and the relationship with democracy since the late 18th century. And if you want to know more about our project, you can consult our website just by Googling conspiracy and democracy. We've got blogs up there, we have all kinds of different pieces of information there. So it's a great pleasure to welcome this evening Darrin McMahon, who is Professor of History at Dartmouth College. He's previously been Distinguished Research Professor, or I should probably say Research Professor, at Florida State University. He taught as visiting scholar at Columbia, Potsdam University, the École des Hautes Études, so he's has an international experience. He has degrees from Berkeley and from Yale. His books include Enemies of the Enlightenment, a study of counter-revolutionary, counter-enlightenment thought and the Making of Modernity, published by Oxford in 2001, and A History of Happiness. A History of Happiness, which obviously everybody's keen to know about because it's been translated into at least a dozen languages. It was one of the best books of the year in the list by New York Times, 2006, and it's been succeeded by his latest book, which appeared now 2.5 or 3 years ago, 2013, Divine Fury, A History of Genius. Presumably if you read 2, you'll discover whether geniuses are happy or not. But it's a great pleasure to welcome this evening. He's going to talk simply about enlightenment and conspiracy. So over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. And thanks to Andrew and Susan and the organizers of the Democracy and Conspiracy Group. I live now in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but I haven't been to Cambridge, England for many, many years, and so it's a real pleasure to be back and see some old friends. I want to thank the organizers as well for prompting me to think about conspiracy again. I confessed to John Robertson just before we started here that I haven't thought about conspiracy theory seriously for really some 15 years, which I realize, as I'm saying out loud, is probably not a real strong endorsement of my knowledge base. But I did think about it at one point rather seriously, and I've begun to do so again in the last several weeks. And it turns out, as you all know, it's an interesting subject. So thank you very much for that reminder. So the title of my talk this evening is Enlightenment and Conspiracy, but it might as well be entitled Conspiracy in the Age of Enlightenment, or just Conspiracy in the 18th Century. For conspiracy rhetoric and conspiracy belief were to be found everywhere in the political culture of that time, on both sides of the Channel and on both sides of the Atlantic. It's true that Enlightenment types were especially fond of this sort of rhetoric in all of their vertical and horizontal embodiments, high and low, radical and moderate, conservative and Christian. That classic treatise of... Good Lord. Now's the point where I make a joke about conspiracy, right? But okay.
We just do that just to
keep you on my toes. All right. I'm used to dodging things from the audience, but not as close. That classic treatise of 18th century radical enlightenment, for example, the treatise of the Three Impostors, presented the entire history of religion as a series of self-conscious plots and conspiracies engineered by criminal masterminds such as Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, plotters and con artists of the highest order, who set out to subjugate the people on the basis of premeditated lies and to capitalize on their deceit. More mainstream or moderate Enlightenment voices were similarly inclined to present the history of religion as a series of cabals led by priests, none of which was more celebrated than the great and, some would say, ongoing conspiracy of the Jesuits to seduce heads of state to further their own sinister interests. As Del Van Cley has shown, this charge was used by an odd alliance of French Jansenists and French philosophes to successfully engineer the Jesuits' ouster, first in Portugal in 1759, and then throughout Europe, leading to the formal suppression by the papacy of the order in 1773. Anti-Jesuit conspiracy theories, however, didn't go away, and indeed, as Jeffrey Cubitt has shown in his book, The Jesuit Myth, Such theories played a central role in French and wider European politics well into the 19th century and long after, helping to expel the Jesuits again and again. The Jesuits, for their part, could give as good as they got, disseminating influential accounts in the 18th century that accused the Jansenists of plotting to infiltrate the church in an attempt to sow heterodox beliefs, and of plotting to infiltrate the courts of Europe in order to sow republicanism. The Jesuits, too, of course, many of whom sat comfortably amidst what Bernard Plongeron long ago and more recently Ulrich Lehner have described as a Catholic Enlightenment, were quick, particularly in the wake of their European-wide suppression, to trade in theories that charged the philosophes, along with Freemasons, of orchestrating a European-wide plot to topple thrones and overturn altars, a subject that figures largely in my first book, Richard mentioned, Enemies of the Enlightenment, and that's an image from the book. It's an engraving by a counter-revolutionary journalist by the name of Jacques Boyer-Brun, published in 1792, that shows the alleged philosophe, Protestant, and Jansenist conspiracy to destroy the church. The white-clad figure in the middle is the church in all her purity. This is Talleyrand, ostensibly a bishop, but godless, as we all know, representing philosophisme. Raoul Saint-Etienne, a Protestant member of the Legislative Assembly who's plunging a dagger into the church's breast. And this is Gaston Armand Camus, who's a noted Jansenist legislator in the Legislative Assembly, who's handing over worthless assignats for the ruins of the church in the background. Enlightenment conservatives, or enlightened conservatives, if you allow me the term, or representatives of a conservative enlightenment, such as Edmund Burke or David Hume, could, for their part, make use of conspiracy accounts as well, with Hume paying ample attention to the conspiracies of kings and their ministers in the history of England, and with Burke doing the same in his Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents of 1770, which pointed the finger at George III's shadowy double cabinet that allegedly allowed hidden operatives to work behind the scenes to thwart the will of the people. Even more dramatically, Burke, in his Reflections, took up the language of the philosophe conspiracy, which, like many of his counterparts in France, he linked to the upheavals of 1789. I hear on all hands, Burke wrote there, that a cabal calling itself philosophic receives the glory of many of the late proceedings of the revolution, and that their opinions and systems are the true actuating spirit of the whole of them. Burke then proceeded to rehearse themes of the philosophic plot, speaking of, quote, the literary cabal that had formed something like a regular plan for the destruction of the Christian religion, end quote, and chronicling the means by which it had seized hold of key organs of public opinion and amassed money and power, quote, carrying the intolerance of the tongue and the pen into a persecution which could strike at property, liberty, and life, end quote. Only the copious detail of some of the more elaborate conspiracy accounts of the 18th century is missing here. And so it hardly comes as a surprise that when Burke received and read the first volume of the Abbé Baruel's international best-selling conspiracy account of the French Revolution, the Mémoires pour servir à l'histoire du jacobinisme of 1797, which described in lurid detail the conspiratorial connections between the philosophes and their Masonic allies to the Jacobins, Burke could write to Baruel with glowing praise. "I cannot easily express to you," he wrote, "how much I am delighted by this first volume. The whole of the wonderful narrative is supported by documents and proof with most juridical regularity and exactness. Your reflections and reasoning are interspersed with infinite judgment and in their most proper places for leading the sentiments of the reader and preventing the force of plausible objections. The tendency of the whole is admirable in every point of view, political, religious, and let me make use of the abused word, philosophical." So that's just a very attenuated cross-section of enlightened opinion in the 18th century. But of course, one needn't be enlightened to construe the world as one moved by the hidden hand of cabals and plots. Those who saw themselves as the most implacable enemies of the Enlightenment were also quick to make use of discourses of conspiracy to account for cultural and political change, implicating not only the Masons, the philosophes, and religious heretics of one sort or another, but also, in a rhetoric that Burke begins to flirt with already in the Reflections, financiers and Jews, a coupling, of course, that would have a long afterlife in the 19th, 20th, and in some parts of the world, 21st centuries. So too did classical Republicans, whether or not they self-identified as enlightened, embraced the language and causal explanation of conspiracy. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for one, famously turned on his philosophic brethren, accusing them in his final work, Rousseau, Juge de Jean-Jacques, of forming a sect, a corps grouped under chiefs who had set out to become the arbiters of public opinion. Disposed to secret intrigues and subterranean machinations, Rousseau wrote, they cultivated the rich and powerful along with the young students whom they initiated into the secrets of the sect and who remained faithful to the plot, acting as their emissaries and operatives in the great goal of sowing materialism and atheism and achieving power throughout Europe, as well as, of course, to persecute poor old Jean-Jacques. In this way, Rousseau concluded, had the century become one of, quote, hatred and secret conspiracies. Rousseau directed his ire here at the philosophes, but more consequential in the long run was the strain in Republican ideology, whether English, French, or American, that cast suspicion on enemies of the people, be they conspiring ministers and kings, political parties and sects, courtiers, aristocrats, or priests. Conspiracy, as Bernard Bailyn argued nearly 50 years ago now in his landmark Ideological Origins of the American Revolution, was absolutely central to the political understanding of the American colonists, who had, Bailyn writes, a general sense that they lived in a conspiratorial world, and who came to believe more specifically in nothing less than a deliberate assault launched surreptitiously by plotters against liberty both in England and America. It was belief in this hidden design, Bailyn concluded, that propelled the American colonists into revolution in the 1760s and 1770s, and it was belief in this calculated assault that underlay the logic of the Declaration of Independence, which is in certain respects one of the world's most famous conspiratorial accounts, accusing George III of plotting to suppress his subjects' liberties. No less famously than Bailyn, François Furet identified obsession with conspiracy as the central organizing principle of the French Republican discourse in the Revolution. The rhetoric of conspiracy, Lynn Hunt concurred, permeated French revolutionary discourse at every political level. And it's worth emphasizing here, as Hunt implies, that conspiracy rhetoric was by no means limited solely to elites, but found echoes and resonance among ordinary people, as it had throughout the 18th century. As Arlette Farge and Jacques Rivel have shown, the people of Paris in the 1750s were convinced that their king, Louis XV, had entered into conspiracy to abduct children from the city streets in order to bathe in their blood. And as Stephen Chaplin argued at length, the so-called famine plot persuasion, the notion that unscrupulous speculators and government ministers routinely withheld the supply of grain to inflate its price and so to make profit from the people's starvation, was a widely shared belief among the peuple. As I say, we could multiply these examples at much greater length with reference to the United Kingdom and, as Andrew knows well, to Germany, other countries too. But I hope what I've said already is enough to convince you of what many in this room at least will already know, and that is just how prevalent conspiracy rhetoric, conspiracy discourse, conspiracy beliefs were in the long 18th century, the Age of Enlightenment. Which raises the question of why. Why this prevalence in an age that is often thought of, however misleadingly, as an age of reason? Well, one explanation is cultural and psychological. The American historian Richard Hofstadter identified in the 1960s what he described as the paranoid style in American politics, a term he applied primarily to right-wing populists in the United States from the 19th century through to the McCarthy era to the rise of Barry Goldwater in the 1960s. Now, I certainly wouldn't want to deny paranoia among many of my countrymen, some of whom continue to believe that our president is not a citizen, that the United States aims at world hegemony, that the United Nations rather aims at world hegemony, the United States probably does, and that any sort of gun control legislation is a plot to confiscate our nation's well-stocked magazines, to say nothing of the conspiracy theory I hold to that Donald Trump is a Scottish plot to make Americans look ridiculous, although we may not need his help. And yet Hofstadter's thesis, I think, is not only tendentious, wrongly identifying conspiracy rhetoric as an exclusive phenomena of the right, but also untenable as a causal account. There may indeed be a paranoid style in American politics, but it seems unlikely that it originates in anything like clinical paranoia, or that it's the determining factor in shaping conspiracy. Hofstadter, moreover, had very little to say about the 18th century, where one may argue that far from being paranoid or irrational, the belief in conspiracy was in fact a perfectly plausible way to understand 18th century politics, which after all were to a large extent conducted behind closed doors, controlled by a relatively small number of principal actors, and riven by factions, intrigue, and divisive sects. After all, history itself was littered with conspiracies, was it not? Any educated reader in the 18th century would have been familiar with the writings, of course, of Cicero and Sallust, whose works were disseminated widely, and particularly their historical accounts of the conspiracy of Catiline. Sallust's brief history of the event was published and republished in Latin and vernacular translations throughout the 18th century, widely excerpted and reproduced. Voltaire, like Ben Jonson before him, wrote a play on the subject. John Adams, like so many others of his age, identified with Cicero, the great denouncer of the plot. And many saw in Catiline's conspiracy, to quote the title of a tract published in London in 1780, as a mirror of the times. The French were also inclined to draw parallels of this sort, but they didn't need to draw exclusively from classical history to find evidence of conspiracies. As Peter Campbell has argued, 16th and 17th century French history, with its aristocratic rebellions and Protestant and Catholic warfare, provided ample evidence of conspiracies, real and imagined, which swirled around sinister figures such as that arch-conspirator, the Cardinal de Retz, Richelieu, and many others. In the 18th century, with its court politics and intrigue, its rival factions and noble circles, its networks of clients and patronage, all too readily fit with contemporary definitions of conspiration, complot, cabale, and conjuration, words understood collectively with varying nuances as a party of people united, most usually in secrecy, against the interests of the state or sovereign, or more broadly as any group of people acting together for a common or private as opposed to a public end. By this reckoning, 18th century men and women were not wrong, and certainly not irrational, to see conspiracies all about them. According to the 18th century man of letters, Duport du Tertre, conspiracies were a standard feature of human history, and his 10-volume Histoire des conjurations, conspirations et révolutions célèbres undertook to chronicle them all. Duport's view was hardly exceptional. Scholars such as Julian Swan, Barry Coward, and Mark Knights have argued conspiracy thinking was a standard feature of early modern European culture. And that's the last of the real conspiracies of the 18th century, the famous failed conspiracy of Babeuf, shown here as a kind of Medusa serpentine figure attempting to stab a knife into the back of the Republic, and the Republican with the pipe there stabbing him in turn and preventing the catastrophe. So which was it? Was the Enlightenment's ubiquitous obsession with conspiracies and plots a paranoid delusion, or rather a clear-eyed realism not at all out of keeping with much older and deeper currents in European culture and thought? One way to probe that question further would be to ask what was specifically enlightened about the Age of Enlightenment's reckoning with conspiracy. And here the American historian Gordon Wood, a student of Balin and the country's leading living historian of the American Revolution, has had something important to say on the matter, arguing in a well-known article published in 1982 entitled Conspiracy in the Paranoid Style, Causality and Deceit in the 18th Century, that what characterized specifically enlightened accounts of conspiracy was an enlightened obsession with causes. Whereas earlier, Wood writes, men had sought to decipher the concealed or partially revealed will of God, now they sought to understand the concealed or partially exposed wills of human beings. That, in a nutshell, was what being enlightened was all about. In their effort to explain complex phenomena that before might have been attributed to providence or the hidden hand of God or the malevolence of demons or Satan, 18th century authors saw human beings pulling levers in secret. It was a way to account for causes when no causes could be found, a byproduct of a new secular account of human history. Now, I might want to qualify that picture some. We have to be careful, I think, about substituting man for God too hastily in the 18th century. And as Jonathan Sheehan and Dror Warman have shown recently in their book Invisible Hands, Self-Organization and the 18th Century, men and women were actually quite good at imagining self-organizing systems and processes that didn't need to be explained by recourse to an agent or the hidden hand of a conspirator. And yet on the whole, I think there's still force to Wood's thesis. And so what I'd like to do in the time that follows is suggest an extension of it, a further development of the thesis that specifically enlightened thinking contributed to the less than enlightened conspiracy theories so prevalent in the 18th century and its aftermath. It's an explanation that intersects with some of my own work on the cult of genius, and the claim essentially is this: that 18th century authors began to formalize, for lack of a better term, a great man theory of history, a theory that presented powerful individuals as the motive cause of historical change, a view, as we'll see, that fit quite nicely with theories of conspiracy. Now, perhaps because of historians' own tendency to dismiss the notion, understandably enough, there's not a lot of writing on the great man theory of history. When it's considered at all, it's invariably associated with the 19th century, the age of Hegel's world historical individuals, or Thomas Carlyle's hero worship, which imagined history, as Carlyle famously put it, as, quote, the biography of great men. Nietzsche would later comment in the uses and disadvantages of history for life that the task of history, both as process and as professional craft, was to, quote, inspire and lend strength for the production of the great man. Well, this kind of rhetoric was certainly strong in the 19th century, so much so that it precipitated, as you well know, a strong reaction. Herbert Spencer was as merciless in ridiculing the pretensions of a great man theory of history as were Engels or Marx, who cast scorn on what Marx described in a dig at Carlyle as the slavish, quote, bowing to nature's noble and wise, the cult of genius, end quote. Marx's invocation of the cult of genius in this instance, he's writing in 1850, was not fortuitous, but was absolutely central to Carlyle's conception of the great man, and indeed to the great man theory of history more generally. And that serves here as something of a clue. For the cult of genius was, in its origins and inception, an 18th century phenomenon. Now, I won't rehearse the details of that birth this evening. It's a subject that I treat at some length in my book, Divine Fury, A History of Genius. Prepare for the shameless self-promotion. There it is. And if you're really interested, Ann Jefferson and I will be speaking on the subject tomorrow night, here in Crash, I believe. Suffice it to say that it's the age of enlightenment that gives birth to the cult of genius, imagined as a new kind of superhuman being, and that in itself is not at all a controversial claim. It's sort of well established. So the 18th century gives birth to the genius, but according to Jürgen Habermas, the 18th century also gives birth to the philosophy of history. It was the period, as he describes the process in his Theory and Practice, when human making in the world, was united with human knowing. In Habermas's reading, the conflation of knowing and making, or verum and factum, gave rise to a new secularized conception of agency previously attributed only to God, for whom to know and to do, as Habermas writes, were one and the same. Knowing and making, knowing and doing, then, was a unity that human beings appropriated in the 18th century and inscribed in the saeculum, the profane time of the world. Now, once again, I'd want to be a little more careful than Habermas is here of seeing Enlightenment philosophy of history simply as a secularization of theology. He wrote this in 1973, and I suspect that Habermas himself would phrase things slightly differently today. There is, in short, more legitimacy to the modern age than that. But at the same time, there's also a good deal of the divine still floating around in the 18th century, and not least in the cult of genius. And yet the general point, that observers on the basis of what passed for enlightened knowledge in the 18th century began to attribute causal agency to human beings where they once detected God or providence, Satan or fate, is, I think, well taken and accords nicely with Wood's similar point. Be that as it may, verum and factum certainly came together nicely in the cult of genius. For geniuses in the 18th century and well after were imagined as figures with privileged, even godlike power, and privileged, even godlike access to the truth. Geniuses are able to penetrate the fabric of existence, seeing beyond the veil of surface reality, to read the mind of God, or, as Einstein would later put it, however, tongue-in-cheek, to know God's thoughts. Geniuses see into the universe and see into our souls, see where others do not. The great 18th century exemplars of genius, at least in the first half of the century, were people like Shakespeare, who was invented as a genius for the first time in the 18th century, and Newton, as Patricia Farah has rightly emphasized. This is the frontispiece to Voltaire's Elements of the Philosophy of Newton, a kind of primer for Newton's thought, published in 1738. And it shows Newton as a kind of conduit of divine truth, right? Guiding divine light to reflect off the mirror of Madame de Châtelet, who is Voltaire's lover and the translator of the Principia Mathematica, then reflecting onto Voltaire himself, who is also inspired by genius. Again and again, in fact, one encounters the notion that geniuses possess or are possessed by some rare and elusive power that confers on them abilities that are continually likened to the religious, magical, or supernatural. Powers of creation, powers of destruction, powers of imagination and prophecy that allow them to do what ordinary mortals cannot. The 18th century, moreover, develops a mechanism for thinking about how men of genius might disseminate their power, and in the gendered terms of the 18th century, geniuses, like conspirators, are almost always men. The mechanism they develop is public opinion, very much an enlightened concept and creation, which in its pure Kantian form is supposed to allow reason to emerge through open critical debate, but which can also in practice, contemporaries feared, be a vehicle of deception and dissimulation, in which the many are led along by the few. In either case, men of letters, or more specifically geniuses, are imagined as those who form public opinion, who shape the spirit of the times. This is the refrain that one finds, for example, in D'Alembert's preliminary discourse, the Encyclopedia, which includes Bacon, Descartes, Locke, and Newton among, quote, the small number of great geniuses whose works have helped spread enlightenment among men. Nicolas Chamfort put it even more explicitly in the 1760s, noting in his fiddily entitled Combien le génie des grands écrivains influe sur l'esprit de leur siècle, that the genius of a few great masters of humanity shaped the spirit of the age, quote, imposing its sovereignty on the mass of men. Antoine Léonard Thomas made much the same point, speaking before the Académie Française in 1767. The man of genius, he declared there, has become the arbiter of the thoughts, of the opinions, and of the prejudices of the public. And this is really quite a widespread Enlightenment, at least French Enlightenment belief, and you find kind of similar theory in Condorcet and Condillac and many others. Now, to be sure, in the context of the old regime, this type of rhetoric was as much fantasy as reality, reflecting the great wish of people like Chamfort and Thomas that they and their enlightened brethren could, in fact, serve as the true legislators of mankind. And yet myths have a way of justifying themselves. Those hailed and proclaimed as geniuses did possess a certain power over the thoughts and opinions of the age. When Voltaire spoke, people listened. When Rousseau declaimed, his followers were moved. Others regretted such influence, saw it as dangerous and maligning. As Jonathan Israel has shown in such painstaking detail, much of Europe in the 18th century feared that a lone and long-deceased Jew by the name of Spinoza was shaping the spirit of the age, for better or for worse. It didn't have to be true to believe it, but to do so was to give the contention a certain plausibility, give credence to the notion that men of genius were in fact the shaping spirits of the age, imposing their sovereignty on the times. The claim became a kind of Enlightenment propaganda, which highlighted the role of great men of genius in shaping historical advance and human progress. Already explicit in writings such as those I've just cited, this view only gets magnified and to many people confirmed by the French Revolution. It is by now the story of Pantheonization, and that of course is Voltaire being led to the Pantheon in 1791. His remains were dug up at his home in Ferney because he wasn't allowed a Christian burial in Paris. And after attending various stations in Paris, brought to the Church of Sainte-Geneviève, now the Pantheon. Familiar story, the story of Pantheonization, as Roger Chartier long ago pointed out, the effort to ground the revolution in a certain paternity and lineage that drew a connection between 1789 and the great forefathers, the philosophes like Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, who prepared and heralded the coming of freedom. Such assertions were early and insistent, and they included not only the great men of France. When news of Benjamin Franklin's death reached Paris in the late spring or early summer of 1790, Mirabeau took to the rostrum to deliver a eulogy in the National Assembly. The genius that freed America and poured a flood of light over Europe was no more, Mirabeau lamented on June the 7th. This hero of humanity who restrained thunderbolts and tyrants was gone. Lauded at the rostrum and celebrated on the stage, Franklin was universally hailed as an avenger of humanity, an apostle of liberty, and a rival of the gods. In short, a genius who had earned the eternal gratitude of French people by paving the way for 1789. And that's an etching after a painting by Fragonard entitled Au génie de Franklin, to the genius of Franklin, with a legend that reads, he seized lightning from the heavens and the scepter from tyrants. And the cult of genius in France and Europe more generally around Franklin is much more extreme than it is in America at the same time, even if it has an effect there. So Franklin had paved the way for 1789, or at least so it was claimed. Franklin's actual role in precipitating the French Revolution was minimal at best, and the same could even be said of his role in the American Revolution. He has done very little, John Adams observed dryly in a diary entry of 1779, lamenting the fact that, quote, it is universally believed in France, England, and all Europe that Franklin's electric wand has accomplished all this American Revolution on his own. Adams' words, to be sure, were colored by envy and pique, and the kind of skepticism he voiced vis-a-vis the power of genius was already out of fashion in 1779, the very year in which Franklin complained in a letter to his sister about being idolized in France, and he puns on the word spelling idolized, I-D-O-L-L-I-Z-E-D. My image is everywhere, he half boasted, half complained, stamped on clay medallions, fashioned in all sizes, set in lids of snuff boxes, and worn in rings. Indeed, he was literally made into a doll, and this is an action figure of Benjamin Franklin from 1790, and there are lots of these of him and of other of the leading philosophes. Well, if John Adams found such idol worship excessive in 1779, it was even more so a decade later. For though the Revolution's cult of genius was in certain respects a natural continuation of the cult that had flourished in the old regime, it was also a new departure, in large part because the open attack on the church and the crown that accompanied it removed barriers to its full and free expression. Without priests to frown at excessive claims to human agency and veneration before idols, without kings to trumpet their sovereignty into postures as God's representatives on earth, geniuses could be hailed as never before. The contrasts are revealing. In the old regime, Voltaire had been denied a Christian burial. In the Revolution, he was made a saint in a church transformed. That is, of course, his tomb in the Pantheon, which many of you have probably seen. And there's really a whole kind of cult of Voltaire as saint. This is a wonderful image from a little bit later, and it's a bad picture, I apologize for that, but it shows Voltaire, and above him the names of Catholic saints, as if he's one of them among them. Of course, it's done satirically, but I think it's revealing nonetheless. This is Voltaire's heart in the urn here. His heart and brain are harvested after his death. His brain has a long sort of peregrination in the 19th century and goes missing, and it's never turned up since. His heart goes missing after changing a number of hands in the 19th century, but then it turns up in 1927, and a lot of press at the time. It's restored to the Bibliothèque Nationale. It goes missing again because people forgot that it had been placed in the statue by Houdon of Voltaire, and when they moved it when they started to move the old Bibliothèque Nationale to the new, somebody moved the statue and the horrible stench came out, and they realized that this heart was there. But it's a way, and this goes on with lots of people, as a kind of cult of the body parts of geniuses, which has, I think, clear relation to the cult of the saints. In the old regime, time was punctuated by the rhythms of the Christian calendar and the commemoration of its martyrs, saints, and kings. In the Revolution, men made haste to conceive time marked solely by the interventions of human beings. As early as an early revolutionary almanac reflected this change perfectly, proposing to replace the saints of the liturgical year with universal figures such as Leonardo, Descartes, Racine, Molière, and Voltaire. In 1793, when revolutionaries abolished the Christian calendar altogether, they vowed to devote a day at the end of the revolutionary year to a festival of the genius, Fête du Génie, one of 5 proposed holidays to conclude the revolutionary calendar in recognition of those who had benefited the nation. As the former actor Fabre d'Églantine explained in submitting the proposal to the National Convention, the Festival of the Genius would honor the most precious and lofty attributes of humanity, intelligence. Even in a republic, genius was treated as a new type of king, and that's a playing card, a revolutionary playing card with genius replacing royalty. Well, that belief, that myth, whether celebrated in the Pantheon or bemoaned in counter-revolutionary phrases, such as "the revolution is the fault of Voltaire," highlights a related way in which the revolutionary experience gave a new inflection to the cult of genius. For by connecting geniuses emphatically to politics and political change, the revolutionaries highlighted the capacity of extraordinary individuals not just to understand the world, but to change it. Counter-revolutionaries, for their part, fully agreed, albeit to their chagrin. Even those such as Joseph de Maistre, who continued to defend the guiding role of Providence, nonetheless gave world historical individuals their due. What Maistre called the génie infernal of Robespierre could move men and make history, even if God ultimately moved Robespierre's hand in retribution, working in his mysterious ways. La révolution, après tout, était la faute à Voltaire, la faute à Rousseau. The fault of great men, diabolically great men, now treated as saints. The rise of the cult of Napoleon, who very shrewdly and self-consciously used the reputation of his genius to buttress his power, only further consolidated this myth. Here was a man who was more than a man, an agent of fate who made fate for himself. He was an artist, a Michelangelo of war, as Victor Hugo later remarked, a poet in action, as detractors such as Chateaubriand and Coleridge grudgingly conceded. A man who destroyed the old to create a new, who created originally, without imitation, according to his own laws in flesh and blood, uniting verum to factum. Napoleon was the prototype of what Germans in the 19th century came to call a Tatengenie, a genius of action, a genius of deeds. Now, Napoleon acted in plain sight, but the theory that underlay the belief that a determined individual or group of individuals, cabal, could alter the course of history could readily be applied to those who acted in secret or behind closed doors. Voltaire and his collaborators had done just that, as both the revolution's detractors and its opponents agreed. Napoleon had imposed his will on the whole of Europe, and surely other imposing individuals might do the same. It didn't take much to get disturbing numbers of people in the 19th century to believe that a Jewish titan of banking like Rothschilds was plotting to control the world of finance, or that a sect of Masons or Carbonari, or anarchists, or communists, or Rosicrucians, the Jesuits, or the Knights of Templar, were conspiring in secret in their shadowy ways, pulling the true levers of power, or of plotting to do so via their many minions and dupes. The belief that such things were possible was predicated on an Enlightenment belief that individuals could make history, and that some individuals, geniuses, masterminds, great men, could make more history than others. The fact that this belief took hold at the very moment that human beings were coming to appreciate the baffling complexity of the human and natural world, living amidst what Sheehan and Warman call, quote, a revolution in notions of chance and order, accidents and causality, agency and aggregation, end quote, should not really surprise us. For conspiracy was, then as now, one way, among many, of grappling with this complexity, reducing intricate processes to simpler parts. We might say that the agency of individuals to make and shape their history becomes all the more compelling the more it is thwarted, the more it is revealed to be untrue. we could probably say the same about conspiracy theories, which are so prevalent in our contemporary world. But that is a story for another evening. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thanks very much. We almost always on these occasions ask one of our team to give some comments and raise some questions for discussion. So this evening it's Andrew McKenzie-McCard, who is one of the postdoctoral research associates on the project. So Andrew. Thank you, Richard.
So thank you, Darrin, for that wonderful lecture, and thank you also for simply coming to visit us here, from the one Cambridge to the other Cambridge. I encountered Darrin's work firstly, your book, the great book on the Counter-Enlightenment and the role it plays in the making of modernity, and so that in itself was enough to justify Darrin being a candidate for one of our kind of short-term fellowships within the project. But then on top of that, I realized that he had been working on Genius in recent times. And we have also docked in here at Crash a project on Genius. And so in some ways, it just seems kind of therefore natural. You've actually taken it a step further in doing something which I actually had not first expected, namely bringing these two topics into conversation with each other and seeing how they shed light on each other. And I find that actually really useful because one of the things which we have discussed in the project, Richard said at the beginning that it's a project beginning in the 18th century, but I think I originally saw it's the 19th and the 20th century, and myself being someone more kind of at home in the 18th century, I remember thinking, okay, that's a bit of a shame because I know it's always a little bit dangerous to start specifying the absolute origin for things, but if you were naively to say where is the birthplace of conspiracy theories as we know them today, I would have said at one stage the 18th century. We've had actually other fellows who have come here who have made the case for other centuries. Cornel Sweerlein was here for a little while, and he talked about the early modern period. He believes there that as a result of certain political factors and certain aspects of the communication infrastructure of the early modern period, he says that that's where conspiracy theories really have their birthplace. I think you, Richard, at one stage also said you could make the case also for the medieval times that, Carlo Ginzburg has argued along those lines with some of his case studies. And so, of course, the whole debate becomes a little bit infantile. At the end of the day, we just have to we have to ask ourselves, how does the status and the character of these conspiracy theories change in the course of time? And one nice way of doing that is to bring the phenomenon of conspiracy theory into conversation with other specific aspects of a specific time. And you've done that with Genius. So the cult of genius. Actually, I think, the people in the Genius project will tell you that, of course, the whole story of Ingenium and whatnot has a lot, there are plenty of antecedents for that whole story. But what I'll do, and I'll keep it very short, and then we'll open up the floor to discussion, and then after that, I believe there's a wine reception. I'll just simply focus upon two things, and I'm just basically playing with your ideas and perhaps extending them a little bit. Firstly, secularization, and then I'll say just a few brief words about individualization. I know that they're very abstract concepts, and perhaps historians therefore are a little bit on their guard when it comes to invoking such concepts. But if you just think about secularization in the terms of a kind of a veneration of the saints being replaced by an idolization of genius, certainly, and your book, the book on the Counter-Enlightenment documents this, people at the time, contemporaries, were certainly aware of seeing that as some kind of decline of religion and as something which perhaps even was going to lead to a demise of religion. And you get these drastic statements from these Counter-Enlightenment figures at the time. Why I found the book so interesting when it came to the whole notion of secularization is simply because you were also able to demonstrate how these Counter-Enlightenment figures themselves were participating in the process of secularization. And a lot of these Counter-Enlightenment figures as defenders of religion were defending religion because they saw it as something which propped up the social order. And so already that is a kind of a notion of religion, not for religion's sake, but rather as something which, it's an instrumental relationship to religion. That, however, also is just, and here I come back to my question about, what is specific about conspiracy theories in the 18th century. It's interesting how at some stage in the 18th century, these defenders of religion stop opposing the opponent of religion on religious grounds. They stop denouncing the opponent of religion as a heretic. And sometime in the 16th or the 17th century, they swap the heretic out and substitute in the conspirator. And so exactly when that occurs, it's an interesting, I presume someone like Voltaire is decried as a heretic at times. But in the course of time, he gets called a conspirator. Certainly when it comes to the whole dispute between the Jesuits and the Jansenists, you see that originally it was a conflict that was fought out on religious terms, and then at some stage in the 17th century, but certainly into the 18th century, no longer heresy, but instead conspiracy. To come to the other point, which I just wanted to quickly pick up on individualization, and once more, that's kind of one of these big, vague abstractions. But of course, it is possible to tell a story of modernity in terms of individualization. Louis Dumont did some work on that, and I think Larry Siedentop has recently come out with this book along those lines. One person I know, one sociologist, Nicholas Luhmann, talked about exclusion individuality, which is not that's a fairly ugly concept in some ways, but exclusion individuality. What he was simply trying to say by that is that it's almost like a zero-sum game, and it represents an intermediate phase in this whole notion of individualization. The geniuses are, of course, in some ways the exemplars of individuality, but there's a statement: we can't all be geniuses. But at a certain stage, we start to say, well, the consolation prize is we all can be individuals. But in this phase where you have this exclusion individuality, there is this notion that basically the geniuses suck all the oxygen out of the room. They monopolize individuality. The cult of genius exaggerates the notion of individuality and does so at the cost of others. And it's just interesting to think about it also in terms of agency. You referred to Napoleon as someone who was kind of like the genius of action. There's a similar kind of thing occurring there with agency. And in some ways here, I'm just paraphrasing what you yourself said, but agency is treated almost as a finite resource where some people monopolize that agency and other people are just basically treated as the dupes and as the cogs in the wheel. And therefore, I was just kind of wondering whether it would be interesting just to kind of consider the different logic which occurs there when we're talking about this exclusion individuality with regard to genius, because that might also help us to understand why we get so much of this individuality and agency located with these great men, these geniuses. And then on the other hand, they can think of other people as being basically just simply passive, blind instruments in their hands. I'll call it quits there. Just a few ideas. I don't know if you want to respond to that, but then after that, we can open the floor up to a discussion.
Okay, thanks very much. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, just thank you so much, Andrew. Appreciate it. That was really thoughtful. And I guess I would just add two things. One is that I'm not comfortable with the notion of secularization in the 18th century, and I don't really think there is secularization. We can qualify that in lots of ways, and clearly there are things going on. But I prefer to talk about changes in conceptions of religion, or a kind of re-enchantment that accompanies disenchantment. This is a point that I think Tom McCur's made really nicely in his recent book on the dead, and I would concur with him there. And I think I try to make that claim in the book on genius as well. And I think if we saw conspiracy theories as a way in which a re-enchantment is occurring at the moment of disenchantment, might be interesting to kind of follow that out. I don't know. I know Luhmann's work on the future, but not on the, what is the term? The
Excluded individuality.
Yeah. So I can only go so far there, but I think it's kind of interesting the way in which kind of individuals are always in dialogue with masses, right? And this is clearly going on in the French Revolution. which is, it's an extraordinary thing that the French Revolution is a period that, which that ordinary people emerge and are agents in history. And yet there's this cult in the revolution at the same time of great men. And David Bell's writing a book on the kind of hero figure in the French Revolution. And it's really a striking thing. The other thing that's going on here is my colleague and friend Antoine Lelty has written a book recently that some of you will know on the invention of celebrity in the 18th century. And that word is an 18th century word, and it's clear that the kind of notion of celebrity emerges at the same time, and there's a kind of overlap with genius, although they're not the same things. But that too makes the person of fame, the impresario, the great performer, a kind of special hypertrophied individual, and that intersects, I think, with the literature on the cult of the self in this period. So anyway, thank you, Andrew, for the comments. And
When I say talking, I was reminded very much of the 1920s in two respects. One is that in Germany in the 1920s, of course, eugenics became very popular in universities, and so there were a lot of attempts to document the families of criminals, alcoholics, vagrants, and all the rest of it, and to try and determine their hereditary influence. And some of the same people in Bavaria thought, well, let's do the same with genius. Yeah. And so there's an institute for the study of genius, which is set up in Munich with an enormous archive about all the families of geniuses they can identify. Yeah. And of course, Lenin's brain Lenin's brain was preserved by the communists, and in fact, some of these German eugenics people and medical people were taken into the Soviet Union to Soviet Institute to study it. There's a wonderfully funny novel by what was his name? Anyway, called Lenin's Brain, which sort of counts its various vagaries, particularly during the Second World War. Yeah. And it runs into trouble. Anyway, that's kind of a bit of a digression. So let's open this to questions.
I have a question.
Please.
Sorry, really interesting talk, and I'm not a historian, and I don't know anything.
Good for you.
So I don't know anything, but I'd be interested in.
Neither did Socrates, yeah.
But one of the things that we're interested in our project is the connection between conspiracy and democracy. Yeah. And I think one of the interesting connections here is precisely the sort of thing Gordon Wood, Bernard Bailey, and others talk about, which is the ideology of the founding fathers, the birth of the American Republic. And one of the things that strikes me as interesting about that is that they talk, or at least in Bailey's terms, they talk about fears of, being animated by fears of a conspiracy, nourished by corruption. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if you could say something about how far we can separate what we project backwards as them imagining conspiracy, being conspiracy theorists, imagining implausible exercises of agency, and how far they were talking about what they were talking about as corruption, namely patronage, the corruption of the British Empire, the sort of parallels that they were seeing between Gibbon's account of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire and the British Empire, and how they wanted to, constitute a republic that would help protect against that. So I suppose it's just asking your thoughts about how this language of corruption, which is, a very plausible and tangible sort of political language, relates to this language of conspiracy, which is, at least from our perspective, much more fantastical and unrealistic.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I'm going to just sort of think off the top of my head here. Clearly in the American case, they're tapping into a Republican, civic humanist language that you can trace to Polybius and others, that makes corruption, moral corruption, a central part of political degeneration, inevitable part, right? And that's emphasized in French are talking about virtue all the time, and it's certainly the case that conspiracy theorists, I'm thinking of the Counter-Enlightenment people that I know the best. They link conspiracy itself to moral corruption, right? Atheism is a kind of, it's just what nasty people, that's where they end up when they slide, into immorality. So there's a connection there. And I'm wondering about some of these other varieties of conspiracy, whether corruption is always an element. I mean, my suspicion is that that's a Republican language that's mirrored oddly by this kind of Catholic discourse that also emphasizes virtue and the importance of family and patriarchy. I mean, there are really kind of interesting parallels that go on, particularly in the Revolution. What occurs to me as well, and I think this is where it starts to get interesting, is to ask, what is specific to the 18th century, right? I mean, I think that people are right. You can clearly find lots of conspiracy language in the early modern period. But it does strike me that something particular happens in the 18th century, and I don't know if anyone's tried to quantify, but I suspect that the kind of numbers of these theories escalates considerably in the 18th century. And so what is distinct about the 18th century, and how do conspiracy theories vary from country to country? And what's striking about the American case is that conspiracy language in some ways sort of dries up at the Revolution. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's my suspicion. And that you see this reemerge in a kind of populist language in the 19th century, but it strikes me that it's actually stronger in certain areas than others. And so I guess my question would be back to you and back to the group: is there a necessary connection between conspiracy language and a language of corruption? Clearly in some cases, but I don't know, Andrew, you may be a better place to answer that than myself. And then, if not, then what are the kind of distinctive pairings in each of these different national carrying cases? So it's not really an answer, but more a continuing of a conversation.
And of course, conspiracy theories and the idea of genius come together, at least in the 19th century. If you think of Professor Moriarty, for example.
Exactly.
The Napoleon of crime was
Sure.
the spider who sits at the centre of a great web of criminality.
Yeah.
So you get this notion in conspiracy theories in the 19th century of an individual genius who is weaving a huge conspiracy.
Yeah. Well, and that parallel that you point out in the German case is really all over in France and even in the UK. That relates criminality to genius, and genius is seen as a kind of degenerative disease, and the end result is crime. But Lombroso and people write about this, and so that pairing of the criminal mastermind, and that there being some necessary connection between moral degeneracy and genius. Yeah, thank you for reminding me of something I wrote about at some length in my own book. Is there clearly in the genius rhetoric? So, yeah, thanks.
Isn't there also a point being made about the way in which that kind of conspiracy theory is sort of self-defeating insofar as it makes rather overconfident assumptions about causation?
Sure.
And in that sort of sense, isn't likely to be able to deliver goods.
Yeah.
And so an awful lot of the writing about conspiracies is also writing about the degree to which conspiracies are a waste of time, because they don't actually achieve the objectives which the conspirators expect them to be able to achieve. I mean, I was thinking there's a 17th century French play called Politique Would-Be, which was written by a chap called Saint-Evremont. This was picked up quite widely in the 18th century by people who were not terribly enthusiastic about the notion of conspiracy for that kind of reason, that conspirators make big assumptions about their causal capabilities. And because they make these big assumptions about their causal capabilities, they sort of blind themselves to other possible causes, and as a result, things don't happen in the way that they expect things to happen. And so this is a play about the English wanting to take over world trade, and it turns out that their plans play into the hands of the Venetians, who are much, much better at conspiracy, of course, than the English. And it sort of works like that. But the underlying idea is that, if you think that you can do stuff, well, think again, because maybe there's more stuff going on than...
I don't know. I mean, from the vantage point of France in the 19th century, the English did take over world trade,
for other reasons.
Yes. Well, that's interesting. I mean, clearly there are famous cases of failed conspiracies, right? The Bavarian Illuminati conspiracy, right? And yet, with the French Revolution, I mean, there are a lot of people into the 20th century who believe that this is a successful conspiracy, right? That results temporarily, but nonetheless, in the destruction of the church and in fomenting civil war and regicide. So whether that's a failure or not, I'm not sure. And then, of course, there are the accounts of the Kennedy assassination or what have you that retrospective explanations of complex phenomena. And I think the very fact that they can't be disproved or falsified is, of course, critical to their longevity. They're like religious myths that just can't be disposed of, and so then they become very, very useful. And then the question becomes, well, how are people using them and to what ends?
I'm thinking about your idea about genius, and also about wondering what was specific about the 18th century.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that occurred to me was that geniuses were getting together socially in the 18th century in clubs, and like the circle around Dr. Johnson, or Mozart and his men sitting together with Freemasons and so on, all the French salons, all this sort of thing. And I wonder if the notion of a conspiracy as not necessarily a sinister manipulation behind the scenes, but as something that groups of well-intentioned people might get together to do. The ultimate example might be the founding fathers. Would this perhaps tie?
Yeah, I think that's actually brilliant. In fact, a good example in the American case is the case of the Society of Cincinnati that Bill Doyle has written about. This is a group set up after the American Revolution to bring together former combatants, American and French, to form a kind of aristocratic club. And there's real fear in the United States that this is a conspiracy to overthrow the Republic. The Society of Cincinnati still exists, but they really had to kind of downplay things there. So it's a club, a kind of 18th century club, that draws that suspicion. And I think you're right. I mean, the other thing that's going on here is you have sociability, not just in a physical sense, but also in the Republic of Letters. Many of Voltaire's letters are published towards the end of his life, and he signs often his letters "Écraser l'infâme," crush the infamous thing. He writes to his brothers in arms, and it's one can make a plausible case that when he's writing to Frederick the Great, he's really plotting a kind of coup across Europe in favor of enlightened values. So I think there might well be something to that, this link between networks and sociability and the way in which conspiracy language flourishes in the 18th century. And there's no question, I think, that it makes use of this idea of public opinion, right? And it is possible now to have causal effect across oceans, right, by the power of print and word in a way that had always been possible since the development of writing, but never in the same degree with the explosion of public letters in the 18th century. So, yeah, I think that would be one of the distinguishing characteristics of the 18th century.
John?
I want to ask about the use of the term sect.
Yeah.
You used it to, sure, I think it was Rousseau was using it, but how is the term sect being used before the revolution in the later 18th century? Isn't it? It may overlap with conspiracy.
Yeah,
but isn't it being used in ways that are in some ways more interesting? It's being given a kind of doctrinal content, separated out from a religious sect.
I mean, I meant to mention this before when Andrew was talking. There was a Keith Baker student who went on and did other things, an Israeli by the name of Amos Hoffman, does anyone know that name? Who wrote two really, really nice articles on origins of conspiracy theory in 18th century France. And what he shows very clearly is there's an obsession with Protestant heterodoxy, and that many of these conspiracy theories grow out of a kind of earlier language that sees Protestants as plotting the downfall of kingdoms and sowing republics and so forth. And that lineage is very clear in France. I mean, when Louis XVI issues the Edict of Toleration, the religious figures who are getting together see this as a Protestant conspiracy, and that language of Protestant conspiracy continues in the 19th century. So often Masons are coupled with Protestants and so forth. So in that respect, sect is has this kind of religious origins right there, I think, embedded in it. Is that sort of what you're getting at, or is it?
The physiocrats were called a sect.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, there. And I think this Lynn Hunt writes a little bit about this as well. That there's a concern with party formation, right, and party groups as sapping the public will, fracturing the sovereignty. And I believe that the word sect is used in these instances before the French Revolution as well. Probably in England, I would imagine, also. But,
Earlier in your talk, you referred to the treatise of the three impostors, which is conspiracy theory on the grand scale, of course, attacking the three Abrahamic religions. Now that recurs throughout the centuries, from the medieval period onwards, and it's not supposed to have been written in book form until the 19th century. There are references in the late 16th century to Machiavelli having been the author, and Grado Harvey, a Cambridge writer, Elizabethan period, refers to it as having been written, and he's seen a copy. And but I just wondered whether it appeared at all in the political polemics of the Enlightenment, the revolutionary period.
It may. I haven't seen reference to it specifically in the Revolution, but there's clearly reference to sort of themes that it evokes. My understanding is that the Treatise of Three Impostors is sort of written in the early 18th century in Holland by a French Huguenot emigre and a Dutch bookkeeper. I'm forgetting their names, probably some of you know. Margaret Jacob has worked on this. And that it actually is published in the 18th century anonymously, but you're right that it is disseminated more in manuscript form than actually printed. It's just too dangerous to publish. But it wouldn't surprise me at all that people sort of, extrapolated back from that and brought in other people along the way. And it wouldn't surprise me at all. I think Andrew Richard made the point that there are similar sort of languages of conspiracy about other religions in the medieval period. And it wouldn't surprise me if you saw something similar there from Jewish conspiracies or Muslim conspiracies and whatnot. That's all I know about that.
Yeah.
I have this is maybe more of a comment, but it comes from what you were saying, and I was trying to think about, so I don't know if this is exactly a question, so I'm still trying to formulate this, but it has to do with what, I'm trying to pick you up on what you said about the shift maybe that you put at the end of your talk from conspiracy to conspiracy theories. And I was just trying to think about the role that the genius, as you described, may have played in that. And there's an obvious story that you might want to say about how if there's this sense of causality and great powers, and of course there's an investment in certain political leaders, but when they're not able to achieve what they said they would achieve, then you can see how space for conspiracy theories might come about. But I do wonder also if there's a different story that can be told, which has to do with the shift from how conspiracies were understood from the 16th, 17th century, 18th to 19th century, which is that you started off by talking about courtly politics. Mm-hmm. And there you can see how, of course, conspiracy could be something that's very much used, but it's not conspiracy in a singular sense, it would be conspiracies. And in many ways, of course, there are coups against the king, etc., but in many ways the plots are there to replace a minister or something. So it seems to work perhaps within the system of politics itself. Whereas what you get with the French Revolution with Napoleon is actually conspiracies against the political system. So Napoleon takes over and it becomes something else. On the one hand, and also it becomes quite a unitary conception of conspiracy. There is a conspiracy. There's no longer potentially lots of conspiracies. So I just wonder if you thought of, I don't know if that thought kind of stimulated any thoughts on your account, but I was wondering if perhaps it did, because it's so that you have a account of the great figure, the genius, the great man who's all powerful, etc., which then compresses the ideas that we have conspiracy, and then opens up the door to the idea of conspiracy theories as being unitary.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. Write it down. Just the demise of court politics is important in itself, and the idea that sort of a modicum of transparency is part of a legitimate regime. I think changes the dynamics pretty strongly, at least in 1830 and going forward. I mean, you have a press, right, and you have a kind of public discussion of politics in a way that you don't really. Prior to at least the second half of the 18th century. And so that does change the terms. It wasn't a question as a comment, I think it's great. It seems to me very plausible. And I guess, I know some of you have been thinking about these matters for a lot longer, or more recently at least than I have, so I think these are precisely the kind of questions that become interesting. You know, what are the shifts that one sees? And I think, going from the plural to the singular, means conspiracies get grander, right? I mean, they're about world domination, right? In a way that they weren't. Cardinal de Retz didn't really care about controlling global finance, right? So, it's interesting.
I mean, it's just one thing that we actually have been thinking about. And I wonder if in the 18th century, what actually occurs is that there are two traditions, basically, which come together, which intermingle. And so when Mike, when you talk about your play from the 16th century, I imagine that he was taking, or from the 17th century, he was taking his cues in some ways from Machiavelli. And the fact that in the discourse, Machiavelli talks about the fact that conspiracies, for the most part, are damned to failure. It's very, very hard to pull them off. And there's almost a kind of a pagan tradition which takes a lot of its cues from the classical history, from antiquity, of thinking about conspiracies in this manner, and as Hugo says, thinking about them in terms of a recurring phenomenon in the plural. In the 18th century, and I know we kind of are careful of using the word secularization and whatnot, but at the same time, I mean, there is this other tradition which doesn't use the word conspiracy until the 18th century, of the notion of sacred history, of the grand plan, and of course you find it in the millenarian thought and whatnot. And somehow these two things, when you read Abi Baraval, then there you have this notion of the grand plan. And there he has taken the conspiracy from this tradition of thinking about conspiracies as a genuine political phenomenon, and it's been absorbed into this other level of this kind of this grand unfolding plan. And I just kind of wonder whether we can kind of think of the 18th century in that regard. And I think actually it really is significant, because previously this notion of, it was called other things, providence or whatever, but it was a religious vocabulary which then absorbs basically an aspect of political vocabulary, and you have then the notion of the grand conspiracy theory, which is kind of what Hugo was also talking about. And that's a shift that occurs.
And that's, I think that account would be consistent with Habermas's and with Gordon Wood's here, that the philosophy of history is a kind of new way of talking about metaphysics. The other thing that occurred to me as you were talking about is the shift that occurs very similarly in the notion of revolution. Keith Baker has written on this, that revolutions goes from a word that's always used in the plural, and actually quite frequently in the early part of the 18th century, to talk about a kind of gradual shift, like a different court faction rises to power, but not revolution, or then revolution like the plan for revolution, plans going around, but not revolution like you get by the very end of the 18th century part of revolution. And then I think that's interesting in itself, because then conspiracies are implicated in bringing down regimes, in fomenting revolution. There's a direct connection there. The other thing that I think is probably relevant here is an understanding of the laws of nature, right? So that there's a kind of post-Newton understanding that one can figure out, one can see beyond the veil of perceived reality to understand the hidden occult causes that are causing things, and there's a kind of new scientific vocabulary for that. Conspiracy theory sort of presents itself as plausible and consistent with that. It's not, but it tries to be. And I think that is also important too.
Well, let's sort of wrap this up maybe. I remember a long time ago, Eric Hobsbawm invited me to dinner with Isaiah Berlin, and Isaiah had a habit of turning every dinner party into a seminar. So halfway through, he rapped the table with his fingers and said, "There are no more geniuses," he said. "There are no more geniuses." And then he proceeded to define a genius. A genius is somebody who changes the way we think or do things. And there are no more, he said. And then we sort of had an argument. And when the notion of genius has become impossible to use after Hitler, Stalin, and Mussolini, all of whom were universally proclaimed in their own countries as being the world historical geniuses, and we can't do that sort of adulation anymore. So conspiracy theories now tend to be collective conspiracy theory. So it's kind of uncoupled the two, but it's very interesting to hear of an age where they were joint together. So thank you very. Sorry, shamelessly name dropping. As somebody once said to Norman St. John Stevens, Norman, you're a terrible name dropper. And I said, I know the Queen told me that only last week. Anyway, this is time, as you can see, to hit the drinks out. Thank you very much.